Okay, 1 Peter chapter 4, our text for tonight, we're going to consider verses 1 through 6. And so I want you, before I read these verses, and of course we didn't study together in this text last week. We didn't have an evening service. So let's just get back up to speed and think about some of the things that Peter has talked about, written about, presented to his audience in the first 3 chapters. Chapter 1, verse 3, you've been born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus, to obtain, verse 4, an inheritance that's reserved in heaven for use, though you're thinking about what lies ahead. Chapter 1, verses 6 through 9, you rejoice in this even if you suffer briefly now, because the outcome of your faith is the salvation of your soul. And this is written to Christians who maybe they're going to be suffering, and as you're going through suffering, it might be hard to consider that brief. We believe this may be written about AD 65. So you've got the fall of Jerusalem coming. Chapter 2, 1 through 3, desire the pure milk of the word so that you can grow. Chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, you're a chosen race, a people for God's own possession, so that you can proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you. Chapter 2, verse 12, keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles. Chapter 2, verse 13, be submissive to human institutions. Chapter 2, verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect. And then chapter 2, 21 and following, Jesus is your example in all of this. If you're having trouble understanding what that ought to look like, look at Jesus. Then chapter 3, 1 through 12, conduct for husbands and wives and how they ought to be treating each other. Chapter 3, 13 through 17, you may suffer for doing good as a Christian, and for such you will be blessed. And then chapter 3, verses 18 through 22, Christ suffered in order to bring us to God, and because of what He did, baptism now saves us. He's now in heaven at the right hand of God. And so here's Peter. He's writing about 65 AD. And so he's writing to the original audience. They're going to suffer some. So let's read through these first 6 verses of chapter 4, and then we'll spend some time talking about them. And the reason I read through all of that is chapter 4 begins with, therefore. In light of everything I've talked about, therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. Interesting text for New Year's Eve, I guess. In all this, they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation, and they malign you. But they will give account to him who's ready to judge the living and the dead. For the gospel has for this purpose been preached even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the Spirit according to the will of God. So let's talk about this, some interesting things in this section of text. So let's talk about the idea of being dead in order to live for the will of God. That's verses 1 and 2. So he says, therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, another way to say that, he suffered death in the flesh. The same thing as saying, therefore, since Christ died. And some translations even insert the idea, since he died for you, or he died for us. And a good reminder in that, the death of Christ isn't a random death, it's a personal death. And you could even put your name in there. Since Christ died for Philip, since he died for you, Philip, it ought to affect Philip the way you're going to live. And so he says, arm yourselves. Now, some of us are likely armed in one way or another just about every time we leave the house, and maybe sometimes when we're in the house. But the idea of being armed is, you're prepared. You're prepared for something to happen. And so now, Colossians chapter 6 admonishes us to wear the armor. I think this is a little different. The way we think is part of our armament. The way we act is part of the way we are armed. And so it's an important thing to think about because the world improperly arms us. Being armed may make you think of being protected, okay? And again, some folks are armed all the time. Some folks armor up when they think there's a possibility of something going wrong. One of my buddies who'd also been in law enforcement was preaching up in Middle Tennessee one Sunday at this congregation, and during Bible class, there was this discussion amongst the young adults, and I mean, it got pretty heated and it got pretty mean, and he's just there as the fill-in preacher, and he said, between Bible class and worship, I just went out and got my gun, because it was to the point I really was concerned for what might happen within the next hour, and so he went out and he armored up. So we understand the concept of that kind of being armed, but it does make us think about being prepared for battle. And it should remind us that personal responsibility exists for each of us to be properly armed as it relates to our spiritual life. I've got a responsibility. I'm responsible both for controlling the way I think and the way I live and the purpose for which I live. And so what is this way of thinking here in verse 1? Because he's saying, arm yourselves also with this same purpose. Because he who has suffered in the flesh, or suffered death in the flesh, has ceased from sin. In other words, and there may be several ways you could think about this, do dead people sin? Dead person cannot commit any sin. And what he's saying there, he's making some spiritual application. If my old sinful self has died, when it was buried in baptism, if my old sinful self has died, should I still be living a sinful life? It's not logical. It's not logical at all. And so verse 2 is explaining the logical way to live. And it's reminding us of why our time here can often be so challenging and frustrating to us. We know intellectually and objectively, I'm supposed to be dead to sin. Why do I sometimes fall into sin? There's a frustration and a tension with that. And so I want to turn back to Romans chapter 6, and I just want to read through verses 1 through 14. A lot of times we'll come here when we're talking about the necessity of baptism and its role in salvation, but that really wasn't the original purpose of the writing there. The purpose is to explain what happens with us when we come to Christ, and it's the logic behind you live a different way because you died. And so let's just pick the reading up in verse 1, and I just kind of walk through it, and let's hear it in its context. What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? May it never be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? So that's the same point we're making over here in 1 Peter chapter 4. If I've obeyed the gospel, if I've died to sin, how would I still be living in sin? Purposefully living in sin. Or do you not know? You know this, this is the way you think about that phrase, that all of us who've been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into his death. Therefore, we have been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. We've been raised for a reason. We've been raised to a new life. For if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, which is what we're doing when we obey the gospel, we're buried like a person who has died physically is buried. If we become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him in order that our body of sin might be done away with, so that we would no longer be slaves to sin. For he who has died is freed from sin. In other words, I'm no longer enslaved to it. I've died to it. It no longer is to control me. So then he says, Verse 8, now if we have died with Christ, we believe we shall also live with him, knowing that Christ, having been raised from the dead, is never to die again. Death no longer is master over him. For the death that he died to sin once for all, but the life he lives to God. Even so, consider yourselves to be dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body so that you obey its lusts. And do not go on presenting the members of your body to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. For sin shall not be master over you, for you're not under the law, but under grace. And so Paul does this really good job of kind of explaining what we're talking about here in 1 Peter chapter 4, the idea if you've died, if you've likened yourself to the death of Christ, if you've obeyed Christ, if you've done what he did, you should be dead to sin. You shouldn't purposefully live in sin any longer. So, again, the challenge is in living out, considering myself dead to sin. Some of the songs, the hymns that we sing. When I survey the wondrous cross, one of the lines in that song, then am I dead to all the globe, and all the globe is dead to me. Really good line from When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. And then 80 or so years ago, Thomas Chisholm and Lloyd Sanderson, they did an excellent job of describing this way of thinking that really ought to be at the core of the way we live. And the song, we don't sing it very often in our worship. In fact, I've run across folks that we've not sung it enough that they even know it, but it's the song, it's titled some ways Buried with Christ. It's also titled A New Creature. But the lines, the lyrics, the words, buried with Christ, my blessed Redeemer, dead to the old life of folly and sin, Satan may call, the world may entreat me, there's no voice that answers within. You know, the phone's ringing and I'm not answering. Think it not strange that things I once cherished cannot allure me or charm me as before. For in the flesh with Christ I've suffered. Old things are past. I love them no more. Dead unto sin, alive through the Spirit, risen with him from the gloom of the grave. All things are new, and I am rejoicing in his great love, his power to save. Another verse, sin hath no more its cruel dominion. Walking in newness of life, I'm free. Glorious life of Christ my Redeemer, which he so richly shareth in me. Dead to the world, to voices that call me, living anew, obedient but free. Dead to the joys that once did enthrall me, yet 'tis not I. Christ liveth in me. And so those words, they encompass what we're talking about here in these first couple of verses. Anything you all want to add at this point, because I've done all the talking so far.
You're talking about being dead to sin. You alluded to that if you're dead, you cannot sin, right? But I don't think,
A physically dead body.
Dead body.
Right.
Is there any correlation? I don't know why it came to my mind. The verse Romans 4:8. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count sin. Count his sin. When we die to Christ, and we're trying to please him, we're still obviously in sin.
Right.
That's kind of what came to my mind. I wonder if there was any.
Well, and that's, and the reality is, and we understand, and it doesn't mean that we don't get frustrated, because if we could live sin-free, we wouldn't need Jesus. And none of us can do that. We all need Jesus. And so what he's really talking about here is the person who has obeyed the gospel, but then is purposefully still involving himself in sin. 1 John chapter 1 talks about the blessing of being in Christ is the blood of Christ continues to cleanse us as we confess our sins. I didn't mean to make that mistake. My emotions got away from me, whatever it was. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to sin, but the blood of Christ cleanses us from sin as we confess our sins. But what he's really talking about here is the person who Oh, I'm following Christ, but I'm still going out and I'm purposefully involving myself in sin. And he's going to talk about the effect on people and how when we no longer live that way, people then they start kind of looking at us differently. And I don't know if that drives to what you're talking about or not.
I just thinking about that verse. I think that when it says when we're baptized, we become a new creation. We die to our sin, as it mentions in Romans. And I think maybe there's a correlation because obviously we're dying to our sin. That doesn't mean our sin goes away forever. And my mind just it may be out of context, but my mind ran to that verse.
Right.
Yeah, we're still going to sin, but blessed is the man who gets to more will not count sin.
Right. It's a good point. Yeah, no, it's well taken. Good point. So the second point in our outline, sinful lifestyles, a thing of the past. And that's kind of what we've just been talking about. That's what those lyrics in that hymn that we were talking about. And so, and there's also a reminder here that time is a valuable commodity. He says in verse 3, "For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality and lust and drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, abominable idolatries," pursuing a course. So part of this is this purposeful still pursuit of things that we know are sinful. Not supposed to live that way anymore. Yes, I've died to sin, but I'm still alive in the flesh. I still have a fleshly life to live in the sense that I'm still human. And so from the perspective of time, I know that each day when I wake up, I start with the same amount as you do if we get to live today. And so what am I going to do? I don't know how many days I've got left, but I know who each of my days is to belong to. And since my time now belongs to Him, I may still be in the flesh, but those passions have hopefully been put to death so that now I live for the will of God. I mean, that's being armed with an eternal purpose, an eternal way of living and thinking. Yes, I may go to work at a secular job, but I'm still armed with an eternal purpose. There's an eternal reason that I'm living my life. And so he says the time that is past is sufficient. You've wasted enough time living a sinful life. And I don't know, verse 3 can work on us in two different ways. You start reading through that laundry list of sinful lifestyle, and sometimes you get to a list like that, and maybe we zone out because, well, that wasn't my life. I was in church all my life. I never lived quite that way. And so maybe we zone out and we don't pay attention. The other side of that is where, we read that and we think, well, man, that was me. That was my life at one point. No matter which place I read that in, I don't need to zone out when I read through something like that. The way to self-examine is to be asking, okay, am I using my time for things that are consistent with living for the will of God? What would our lives look like if we lived every day like today might be our last day? And that's cliche, and I get that. And a lot of songs have been written. If today was your last day and tomorrow was too late, could you say goodbye to yesterday? Would you live each moment like your last? Leave old pictures in the past. Donate every dime you have. Would you call old friends you never see? Reminisce old memories. Would you forgive your enemies? And that's a secular song. It has nothing even to do with, it's not even a spiritual song. But Peter's reminding us that time is valuable. It is our most precious commodity. And we do well to make choices in light of this. This could be my last day. We were talking we were doing James chapter 4 with the young people this morning, and we were talking about, when we make those plans without the Lord's will and remembering whether or not, if the Lord wills, we don't know what's going to happen. Our lives are a vapor compared to eternity. So, he's saying a sinful lifestyle, it's illogical, it ought to be a thing of the past. But then there's also a great reminder in verse 3. We serve a God And we've been saved by a God who can clean up lives that have been messed up, really messed up. And so his audience here, he's writing to Christians, but the reminder for us as we read this, Jesus died for everyone. We don't write folks off because their lives are such a mess. Jesus died for everyone. And he's writing to some Christians who they've indulged themselves in all these things, but they are not those people anymore. Okay? 1 Corinthians 6, verse 11. Paul wrote and he went through one of these laundry lists of sin. And then in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 7, he said, "And such were some of you, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God." One of the things that has been interesting to me, working so many years with the school, many a career in ministry has been born out of lives really lived far away from God. And then once God gets a hold of somebody and gets somebody's attention, they are so overwhelmed and so overcome by what God has actually done for them that then they decide, I'm going to give the rest of my life in ministry. And they end up in school. And we've seen it over and over. Yes? Yes. Right.
Then you mentioned again about arming ourselves.
Right.
Okay. The version I have said instead of arming, it says so you should strengthen yourself with the same kind of thinking Christ had. So maybe that laundry list, anything is in that list that is not having our minds aligned.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and
You know, I mean,
because that's one of the other.
some of us will say something, will not or gossip. You know, I think you just don't think that's a sin like drunken parties and all this other stuff. But I think that these whole few verses we're talking about tonight, anything armed or if we're not strengthening our mind to think like Christ, we belong. Whatever we're doing, if it's not like Christ thinking,
Yeah.
then that is.
Yeah, the Bible is famous for some of these laundry lists of sin. You're like, it's going along and it'll be listing ones that we see really, really bad, and then it'll be like liars, disrespectful to parents, disobedient to parents. I mean, it'll throw in those ones that we're like, well, we've all been there, you know. So, oh yeah, absolutely. Right. Right. Sure does.
Lust. We say lust. Many of us go to sexual lust. But lust, I wish I had. I wish I could do this.
Covetousness. Yeah, that's a good point. Right. And that's again, it's what makes this a challenging text, because we're supposed to be dead to all of that, and yet we still have to fight that battle to keep it at bay, to keep it dead to us. So, excellent comments, and I'm glad you brought those things up. Very important. Yes? No, that's all, you know. If I don't know, I'll say I don't know, and I'll look it up, and we'll talk more next week.
My version said, ESV said, it goes through the list and it says sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties. I just wonder, is there a difference between drunkenness and drinking parties, or is it kind of the same thing? Or does your version say something?
The New American Standard's got drunkenness and drinking parties. You can get drunk alone at home, I guess. It's not a drinking party. Yeah. And it might take into account, I'd need to look at it. So,
I think drunkenness is just run-of-the-mill alcoholic, never stop.
yeah,
And drinking parties would just be.
could be. Yeah, and I know it's one where some people like to have their little bit of alcohol here and there, and the Bible doesn't say this is sin to never take a drink.
You're going to get into 1 Peter 5,
Yeah,
and it's going to say be sober-minded, be watchful. And how much alcohol
It's, what I'd like to do, there's a friend of ours and his health isn't great now. He's an elder in the church, but he is an alcoholic. And, I'd like to have him come down and teach the lesson on why you ought not to drink. That's who you need talking about it, is an alcoholic. Because when they say you'd be better off not to drink, I think it carries more weight than maybe some of the rest of us. But anyway. No, it's all good. It's all good.
So Philip, the NLT says in their terrible worship of idols, and I think in this period of time, some of these things he's describing were actually religious.
Yes.
So I mean, all this feast and parties and all this going on was done in the name of some god.
Yeah, some of the sexual sin was done in the name of, yes.
So he's just saying, you serve a different kind of God.
Right. Good point. Good.
What Kay said, that scripture about every, what you're saying, it makes me think like, if you've ever cared about somebody that is a recovering alcoholic or drug addict, they'll tell you, and they're not gonna do it, but that
Right.
desire is still there. I mean, it's like a cigarette.
Yeah.
People smoke, they can never not want a cigarette. And I keep going back to gossip, because that's what I feel about my tongue. Or maybe not gossip, but just say too much.
Well, some people will say, well, if it's true, it's not gossip, or,
But what are those things? Is
Yeah.
it hurtful? Is it whatever?
It's not helpful a lot of times.
But, I think that scripture about every day helps that alcoholic every day. Helps me to control my tongue every day. So maybe that correlates as well.
I keep referencing our class upstairs, but one of the things we talked about last week, and it would bless all of us, and I don't know why we're this way, but like in the course of ministry, you end up knowing things, about sins that are going on, and you just kind of wish you didn't even know. And you wish you didn't have to know. And the more we could get to the point that we really didn't want to know about the trouble and the bad things in people's lives, that would probably help us as much as anything with, the gossip. Because some people just live for it. They want to know what the dirt is. I mean, you can just see it in their eyes. The more, they're just like on the edge of their seat waiting to hear. And, man, I don't want to know. Because it's, even when somebody then starts trying to do right, we don't forget. And even if we're not holding it, you just wish you never had known they had that problem. And I think the more we could cultivate that kind of, I just wish I didn't know. And because that way when somebody starts talking, I don't need to know this. It's easier to say that. It's easier to stop it.
How are you going to help someone if you try to avoid it?
Do what now?
How are you going to help someone?
That's what I'm saying. In the course of life and relationships, there are things you end up having to know. Somebody comes to talk to you about a problem, and they're going to share it. But again, even as you're helping, I wish I didn't even know this. It's just, if we could get there, I think we'd be better off. Well, and even with God, the word forget, I think the literal meaning is it's no longer on our account. It's no longer held against us. He remembers it no more in that when he looks at the ledger sheet, there's nothing there. Now, the idea that God wouldn't still know what I did in my past, he's omnipresent. He's all-knowing. I don't think there's any way he wouldn't know. But I think the literal idea of the word is the not holding against. It is hard for us, really hard.
I think there's a fine line between gossip and trying to know something to help someone.
Right.
Because you have to know in order to
Right.
And if you've ever been there and done that, then you understand it.
Oh, yeah. I don't disagree at all that you're exactly right. Sometimes the way our information comes is third, fourth hand, and
You know, to help everybody, you know, that also need to know, you know what I'm saying?
right. Well, let's go on into verse 4, 5, and 6. And so as we're thinking about this, okay, there's a past, there's also a reminder here that it is better if we've never indulged in some of these things, and that's because of verse 4. Verse 4 reminds us that our influence, there's an influence factor based on the way we live our lives. He says, in all this, they, the Gentiles, the people who've lived these sinful lives that he's just described and that you used to be a part of in many cases, they are now surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation, and they malign you. You always used to go with us. You always used to drink with us. You always used to do whatever. It's better to not have ever done it. Why? Because then they're not going to be surprised that you don't do it, because you never did it. But he says when if you've changed your life, if that was your past and now God has gotten a hold of you and you've cleaned up your life, you can expect some folks to kind of not understand. What I found traveling for work when I was in the secular world, generally, people will respect your lifestyle, even if it's not a lifestyle they live. If you're traveling with them and they're going to, I don't do that, they generally will respect that. But if you used to do that, some are going to be surprised because the last time they saw you, you were right there with them, and they may try to pull you back into that. And if they can't, that's when they're going to malign or speak evil of you. Whoa, you think you're too good for us now, or, we've all heard those kind of things. One guy who's now a preacher, he had a past, and he ran into somebody years later, and when the guy figured out who this guy was, he's like, "You're a preacher?" Because he remembered his past, and he's like shocked at the turnaround. But Peter's saying, you are dead now. Sinful. You're dead to a sinful lifestyle. That's got to be a thing of the past. And then the thing that also should be a thing of the present is evangelism, so that the lost can then live. Let's look at 5 and 6. But they will give account. These people who are living in sin, these people who are surprised that you don't run with them anymore, these people who may be maligning you, but they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For the gospel has for this purpose been preached even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the spirit according to the will of God. So a couple of things here we want to touch on, and we've touched on some of this out of a previous chapter. Think about it this way. One of the questions Peter is answering, he's answering a pagan objection of the day. Pagan would look at Christians and go, hey, you people die just like we do, so why be a Christian? You're going to live your years, you're going to die, we're going to die, why be a Christian? The answer is, and we know this, because Judgment Day is coming. Now that phrase, preached even to those who are dead, we're not talking about something that happens to people who die physically, their physical life is over. After their physical life is over, there's not a message preached to them after that point.
Then why do we do it?
Do what?
Then why do we do it?
Why does the denominational world do it?
No, we do it too.
We do?
Yes.
We preach to people who have died?
Yes.
Okay.
Have you ever been to a graveside service? There's people out there dead all over. And then here we are, we open our Bibles and we're preaching. They're there present, same as we are, even though they're dead.
Well, when I'm doing a graveside service, I'm there to help the folks who are still alive.
Yeah, but it says you're preaching still to the dead.
No. I'm not preaching to the dead. I don't think when my dad has done a service, he's not preaching to the dead.
Bible preacher,
I know. You've got grace. But here's what's going on. And it's useful. There's a couple of things here. If you understand them, I think it's useful in kind of getting his point here. William Barclay has a statement that I think is really good. And I'll start with a question. Why do each of us die physically? If Jesus delays his return, why will each of us die physically? No. What? No. It's because we're sinners. The reason we die physically is because we're sinners. Before sin entered the world, there wasn't death. There wasn't physical death. They had access to the tree of life. Physically, they could have lived forever. When sin entered the world, physical death entered with it. So for mortal man, physical death is really the penalty of sin. And after all, it's sin which brought death into the world. Romans 5 verse 12, therefore just as through one man sin entered into the world and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned. So Peter says, all men in one sense have already been judged when they die. You were a sinner. That's why your physical body died. And because they're men, they're under the judgment of death in that sense. Yet because of the preaching of the gospel, even those who are judged by physical death, Jesus has provided everyone with the opportunity to live in the Spirit of God. And like you said, to be born again. And that's why death doesn't ultimately have to win, or doesn't ultimately win. Barclay concludes with the opinion that this is one of the most wonderful verses in the Bible. For the gospel has for this purpose been preached, even to those who are dead. When they were alive, they had the message of God that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they're going to die physically, they may live in the Spirit according to the will of God. We die physically because sin entered the world.
James Barron Hope, he was at one of the first memorial services, and one of his quotations was, "'Tis after death that we measure men." In same way as that's what God does.
Yep.
It's 'tis after death that are we judged.
Yep.
And that's a lot of times that's what we do to people at death, is judge them, how they live their lives.
Right. And so one of the things to be thinking about as we're trying to live this life, the judgment day is coming for those who are still in sin. If we've changed our lives and they're surprised by that, judgment day is still coming. If they're mocking and maligning us, judgment day is still coming. Those who make me mad because they're giving me such a hard time, judgment day is still coming. We're all going to stand there in judgment. And what they need most is our help in helping them understand that God's help is available to them. And the reason we live for the will of God, the reason we regard ourselves dead to sin, the reason that we're careful about the way we use our time, the reason that our lives are devoted to living for the will of God, judgment is coming. And what we look forward to is being in heaven with God forever. And that's the reason for evangelism. The text should provide us, these verses should provide us with a jolting reminder about our need to be committed to sharing the good news. Because for a lot of folks, the house is on fire and they don't know it. And the ship's sinking and they're busy rearranging the furniture. Or they're flying down the interstate of life, but they're on the wrong side of the interstate. And the question is, are we going to watch the house burn or the ship go down, or are we going to try to help? We preach, teach, try to live the good news because it makes an eternal difference, not just for us, but hopefully for the folks we interact with. And the need's critical. It's 6:44, the stat I used. If our service lasts 45 minutes, and that's right, the number we're up on right now, in our 45 minutes or so tonight, just over 5,200 people have passed from this life. It's about 116 people a minute. And when you die, physically, there are a lot of things that may have mattered before that don't matter now. What's the one thing that matters? Were what kind of, were you ready for that? Had you given your life to God? Did you obey the gospel? And so the clock's always ticking. So I appreciate the comments. Yeah, go ahead. No.
I love what you said about that older that you know that was an alcoholic. I
All
don't love it.
right.
But I love the fact that you said, people have a bigger impression on us than you have drank. I mean, you
Right.
say it, they can, and I think that's such a beautiful thing about someone who's been in a place in their life where they really should be, and how big they can almost
Right.
influence people more than people who have always been in church, right? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So for anybody in that situation, look what you did.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes we lose sight of the fact that, the first time we violate God's law, we're in the same boat as all those folks on that big laundry list. We put things in categories more so. But the reason we need Jesus is because once we've violated God's will, we're lost. And so anyway, but I appreciate all the comments and the discussion tonight, and was trying to move a little more quickly there at the end to kind of get us through these 6 verses. So anything else?